Millions of despairing men, women, and little children, victims of a system that makes men torture and imprison innocent people.
You cannot shake hands with a clenched fist.
Produced by a nuclear exchange would be carried by wind and water and soil and seed to the far corners of
the kingdom of God, the kingdom of heaven.
It's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
We're not saying that planet Earth is coming to an end. We're saying that planet Earth is about to be refurbished, spaded under, and have another chance to serve as a garden for another civilization.
Most of the people in here are just your reflections. They're your mistakes.
1776 will commence again if you try to take our firearms.
1 million of the planet's 8 million species are threatened.
You are what you repeatedly do. Therefore, excellence ought to be a habit, not an act.
Your lives and the credibility of the United Nations is at stake.
Epstein didn't kill himself.
The reason this is such an interesting time is not only because we're on the threshold of the end of this civilization.
They're trying to take you out with bullshit.
The experience of the past 2 years has proven beyond doubt that no nation can appease the Nazis.
To those who can hear me, I say, do not despair. The misery that is now upon us is but the passing of greed, the bitterness of men who fear the way of human progress. The hate of men will pass, and dictators die, and the power they took from the people will return to the people. And so long as men die, liberty will never perish.
In the language of the U.S. Department of Defense, these are unidentified aerial phenomena.
Roswell's a very interesting place with a lot of people that would like to know what's going on.
There is very compelling evidence that we may not be alone.
This is the Garden of Doom.
Welcome everyone into Garden of Doom, and we're revisiting with one of our old friends, Mark Olly. He's been on the show a few times before. We did the complete King Arthur, the Polychronicon of King Arthur, which is still a word that I have trouble saying, but I know what it means. We also did the real Robin Hood, and I think way back when we did the Crystal Skulls and other skulls, including Paracas Man and other anomalies. I think that's all the shows he's been on, but, go back and check the old shows and you'll find out. So, Mark, welcome back into Garden of Doom. It's a pleasure to have you.
Hi, it's always a pleasure to come on.
Excellent. And today, this is a topic that actually Mark proposed, and I'm really excited for it. I actually had a little bit of insomnia last night trying to figure out which was going to apply best. But you know what? I think I'm just going to allow the guests to lead more often than they typically do here, and I'll try and follow along and do my usual chiming in where I think something is relevant, and maybe I'll be right, and more often than not I'll probably be wrong. But we're doing the mythology of Star Wars, which is something that I'm old enough that I watched Star Wars in the theaters, all 9 of the movies in real time in 1977. Then I saw Rogue One and Solo. Rogue One I saw in the theaters. Solo I waited till it was on streaming. And I've seen a bunch of the cartoon products. So there's a lot embedded in there. I assume we're going to be focusing mostly on the main story and certainly canon, but I don't know. Take us to a galaxy far, far away, a long, long time ago.
Okay, I can do that. Well, like you say, it all started for me in 1977. I've got an interesting story. I'll throw a few interesting stories in, and then I'll explain where we're going with the mythology side of it. As a teenager, I used to spend a lot of time making amateur 8mm movies with a movie society. And we came up with this fantastic idea. We thought, I think it was about 1976, 1977. We thought we'll do a science fiction movie. And what we'll do is we'll theme all of our characters to the color that's appropriate to their character. So, the good guys wear white, the bad guys wear black. Some of the in-between characters were reds and blues and this, that, and the other. And anyway, we actually started making it. I think it began to film in 1976. And it was just, the working title was The Dreamer. And we managed to film quite a bit of it. We did a few reels, which were expensive back in the day. And then all of a sudden, 1977, ta-da, out comes this Star Wars. And we're like, oh, that's just ruined it. That's killed it flat. Because obviously the bad guy wears black and the good guy wears white, and there's an old wizard in brown, you know, and all the other characters are all themed like that. And I'm like, oh, that's just destroyed it. So we never got to finish it. We never actually got around to finishing it. So there's just a couple of reels of this thing called the Dreamer now. That's we got them digitized the other year, and that they sort of exist. But that leads nicely in, because obviously I did the same as you. I went off to see, you know, this first Star Wars movie at the cinema, and I sat through it and I thought, you know, 1977, I thought, I can't believe what I've just seen. So back in the day, they never used to come round and check your tickets. Not in the town where I live here. You could sort of sit in there and wait for the next crowd. Yeah, wait for the next crowd to come in. So I sat in there and I watched it again a second time. And there were 3 showings a day. So I watched all 3. And then I thought, I still can't believe what I've just seen. So I went back the following day and I watched it 3 times again. And this is in the cinema. Anyway, I went back the 3rd day. And on the 3rd day, I watched it through. I think it was the 7th time. Anyway, and the woman who was in charge of the place came out and she said, "You're a big fan of this, aren't you?" And I said, "Yeah." She said, "Well, so the local walking day's coming up, which is the local parade." And she said they weren't sure, because of the nature of the film, and this is ironic looking back, they weren't sure whether it was going to need a bit of extra promotion. So she said, "Well, you're such an enormous fan," she said, "follow me, come and see this." So she took me to this store cupboard, opened this big cupboard up, and all the costumes are hanging in this store cupboard, because apparently they duplicated them and sent them round with that first movie. So I got to handle Darth Vader's costume. I got to handle a couple of the others. I think there's only one droid in there. I think it might have been R2. But they got about half a dozen of these costumes. I was just absolutely blown away. So at that point, that was it. I was completely sold on it. So very much like yourself, I went off and saw the first 3 movies that they made, which of course later became, you know, whatever it is, episodes 4, 5, and 6. Right. I went off to see those actually, you know, shown on a big screen in the cinema, which was interesting because when they came to rename them and they came to rebrand them, they also tweaked them. They actually, you know, did a few things to them. So you might remember this actually. When I went to see that first film, I saw the first film so many times. I was like, you know, in the Cantina bar, there's a bloke wearing a Second World War gas mask. You know, the speeder goes whizzing across the desert, and the next minute when it stops, he takes a gun off the side that wasn't there in the previous shot. You know, so there's all these things. I got to see it sort of raw, as it were, you know, in the rough. So I just became a massive fan. But the point of sort of telling you this is really about the fact that generally creative people down the ages have switched on to this idea that there are certain overriding themes. And the first one that I ran across was this idea of color. Now, coincidental with all this happening in the, you know, in a galaxy far, far away, I also started to do the King Arthur material, which has been, you know, a 45-year odyssey. And I started to notice that there were overlaps. And then, you know, as you kind of do, you think to yourself, well, yeah, maybe I'm just going nuts here. Maybe it's just a coincidence, you know, and, you know, maybe these overlaps are just because if you tell this kind of story, you know, that's what happens.
Right.
In the 1980s, I'm pretty sure when they did the next 3, they had a touring exhibition, and it was called The Mythology of Star Wars. Now, some people might remember this, and it basically compared the Irish legends of, you know, Cuchulainn, then King Arthur and Arthur's legends, and then 1 or 2 others, and it compared it then to the mythology of Star Wars. And I thought, you know what? I'm right. I'm actually right. You know, Lucas has actually gone away and he's done his homework and he's done his, you know, study, and he's pulled in themes that are deep rooted, you know, psychological, mythological themes from the past. And he's he's kind of rebranded them. So it just made me look at the whole thing, especially those first three movies, although they're 4, 5, and 6 now. It made me look at them in an entirely different way, because the stories that he was telling then do have their roots in mythology. I think I'm right in saying, subsequent to that there were some interviews where he actually spilled the beans, and he actually said, I did actually base, this character on Merlin, this character on Arthur. I'm pretty sure he's gone on record at some point, probably in the 1980s, I would think, in saying that this is what he was doing. And he basically reinvented it. He made it again, for modern times, for the age that we live in now. So really, that was my thing. And I thought, it'd be great to chat this through with somebody like yourself, who's in the know and clearly has loads of questions to ask me. It was a good idea to sort of go with it and see where it took us.
I have questions for myself, which, of course, in this, you're gonna play the role of me, who's more focused, I suppose. But yeah, I think obviously, Star Wars was described as a space Western, which are often described as, American versions of samurai films, and that's all correct. You have the Jedi Knights, but the parallels to Arthur were, definitely strong.
Yeah.
Ben Kenobi was Merlin. He's been sort of watered down of one of, and sort of a countless number of Merlins, and of course there's evil Merlins, which was, also in Arthur. There was Morgana Le Fay, and you have sort of the bad sire Modred, which is part of Arthur. I guess going out of order sequentially, that could be like Anakin, but Luke clearly seemed to be the Arthur figure. The boy king didn't know he was a king. Got the sword not exactly out of a stone, but it was his father's sword. Same thing, the good versus evil. Lord of the Rings, Lord of the Rings in a different sort of style, and then you have your quest, where there's always sidetracks and you need to build your fellowship. It wasn't can't remember. I think in Fellowship of the Ring, they were deciding on numbers and saying these are very lucky numbers, or this is an unlucky number, and all of that's in mythology as well. But there was the trope of the son taking over for the father, though there was a twist here. There was a trope of losing part of your body in sacrifice. In most myths, the hero loses an eye and or dies and gets resurrected. Well, Luke lost his hand, and he sort of repeated the mistakes of his father, which is also sort of a thing of mythology, usually that gets sort of resolved by the third generation of the deities. But I couldn't think of one where you had sort of like this Darth Vader evil character that was conflicted, like he was good, then he was evil, then he, I was thinking, is Egyptian mythology, is Set the one, was Set the one that started good, then turned evil, and Horus had to defeat him and lost his eye, and then Set got back into order, or was Set just killed? The problem is, there's so many mythologies I don't remember, and I don't know what Lucas was like. I don't know much about Irish mythology. That is a real, Celtic Irish mythology. That is a real hole in my game. And I'm actually I'm talking to someone next week about possibly being someone who can fill that. So tell me if any of this is what you were latching. Some of it must be, because it's not.
Yeah, I might be able to answer one of the mysteries, because I do believe when the exhibition came around in the 1980s, I think also included in that was Norse mythology. Now, when you get into the Norse mythology, that's the losing the eye. So that's where that comes from. Obviously, then you've also got this Jedi Council who, lo and behold, they're meeting in a circular room. It's a round table, and like you say, the numbers game, that comes into the fore there. But basically everything you've just said is true of where Lucas was coming from. That's what he was aiming for, to create this mythology, and to some extent, I think he stayed true to the mythological characters, because some of them, especially like you say in Egyptian mythology, they start out basically as either good guys or what I would call a blank slate. So in other words, they're all the same. You don't really know who's a good guy or who's a bad guy. It all starts out that way. And then in most mythology, somebody either turns good or turns bad. That's, you know, for moralistic purposes. I mean, in the Trials of Arthur, if you read a lot of the different, you know, tales and the different stories and, you know, the morals that come through, like the guys that pass the Grail test and the guys that fail the Grail test are very similar in what they're doing, the quests that they're on. And I have to say, all of the Star Wars universe, no matter where you go from Solo and Rogue One and all the recent ones, all the way back to the originals, they're all on a journey. That's the theme, you know, the storytelling device. I think if there's a blanket that covers all of them, they're all on a journey. It's either, you know, from a galaxy to another galaxy, or they're fighting good and evil, so that's the journey, or they're on a personal quest, a personal journey that's transformative or not. You know, it's kind of, but one way or another, it sets up the idea that all the characters are sort of flowing, you know, they're flowing towards something, they're heading off to a goal, they're on a quest, it's a journey. And it's really, that's what it is. It's the 21st century equivalent of all these ancient mythological tales. In most respects, I think it's more obvious when you know what you're looking at than things like Marvel and DC. I mean, they've really, you know, they've really nailed the colours to the mast, but in a very obvious and blatant way. But I think the Star Wars universe does it, but does it better. Because if you know where they're coming from, it's, hey, you know, wow, yeah, you know, even down to Jar Jar Binks, you know, the village idiot or whatever, the Joker, the left field, you know, the character everybody dislikes because they're silly. Fool. Even that, you know, yeah, the fool, that's what it is. But that's more medieval, you know, than it is anything else. That's the sort of character, the comic character that you would find in a medieval tale. It's not, you know, it's not kind of DC or Marvel. It's not kind of going that way where everybody's a superhero. It's not, you know, it's more akin to its original roots. Yeah.
Well, yeah, to be a hero, there's really only two ways I'm aware of in a literary way to do it. And one is to go out and do something, to go on a quest or a journey or to expand territory, even if that journey is the underworld. I say even, that's a stupid word to use to go into the underworld. Or if you're staying home, that you're standing your ground from, you know, odds that you know, like you're in Helm's Deep. You shouldn't be able to withstand the onslaught, but, you know, you and whoever is with you or you alone do it. I mean, the other thing, you know, maybe the most obvious thing that I sort of left out was you have the twins, sort of the holy twins, you know, whether they know they're, you know, a brother and sister, even if they're not twins, that, you know, work together, you know, and the twist, but not so much of a twist here, is that while we thought Luke was the star and sort of remained that, at some point, Leia was the one who was supposed to be special. And I'm not really sure, you know, what happened with the movies and whatever, where that sort of got lost and forgotten. But Leia was the one who was supposed to be stronger with the Force. Then they just had to become like a general and stay that way, which seems a little silly. But maybe it was because Carrie Fisher didn't want to do the role or couldn't or whatever. I don't know. But, you know, it's, you know, Isis was more competent than Osiris in something. She's the one who, you know, brought him back to life. Athena seemed to be, you know, has a more prominent role than Apollo, even though Apollo did some of the, you know, dirty work. You know, his father had to kill Typhon, but, you know, Apollo had to kill Python. You know, I mean, it's...
Well, yeah. I mean, if we go down the mythology route, then really what you're dealing with actually, as it gets later and later and later, and you start dealing with the twins, what you're dealing with there really is Gnosticism. It's the Gnostic idea that actually the power resides in the female. You know, it's kind of leaning that way where the female characters come forward. So I think there's a bit of a sort of strand of Gnosticism that's crept in the later movies. I'm not entirely convinced that you know, big reveal of the fact that, you know, there's a family connection there. I wasn't sure that completely worked. I think that was one of the bits of the plot that, you know, didn't really hang together. And like you say, there were other characters, stronger characters, that they really should have developed a lot more than they did from that original story. Like you say, Leia is probably the biggest one. I mean, she kind of really lost out in the later movies. I think it possibly was down to Carrie Fisher. I think they had difficulties behind the scenes with issues as the years have rolled on, and also the way that the franchise went off, at a tangent. It left a lot of those original characters behind, and they just start coming back in then as, guest stars or whatever, almost. I mean, that was the big fear, wasn't it? That Disney was, you had all these cartoons, with Mickey Mouse running around with a lightsaber, and all the main Star Wars characters with Mickey Mouse ears on, and people were terrified that they were just going to destroy it. They changed it, but in many ways, I think they changed it for the better. Also, in the early days, the reason they remastered all the movies is, of course, Lucas couldn't get the effects that he wanted just purely using the mechanical effects, because people forget just how primitive, how long ago those first three movies were made. Everything you saw on the screen effectively was real. I can still remember watching those first three movies and seeing the matte lines, where they matted on additional ships and things, and you could see that. I mean, that's perhaps one of the better things with the remastering.
You could see it because you watched it 6 times in 2 days.
Well, yeah, you could see where they'd been added on.
Or in later years, you really couldn't see it. Well, maybe I couldn't see it because I was like 10 when it first came out. I think actually younger. Yeah, definitely younger. I was probably still 8, though. It was my 9th year. Basically, because I remember it came out. It was like a summer movie, but I think it came out in May. And now you can see them, but at the time it's like I had never seen anything like that on this.
When they did the box set over here, they released what was the new 1, 2, and 3, and then they released the original movies 4, 5, and 6, and they did it as a box set. And there was a bonus disc with it. Now, if anyone's got this bonus disc, it's a Star Wars collector's item. I've got one of them. And what they then did was they ran the unmastered and the mastered footage next to each other so that you could see what they'd actually done. Now, from the general public's point of view, I think that was absolute genius. I think, hats off to Lucas for being brave enough to do that. And they did improve it. They definitely improved it. And as time has gone on, he's improved it, and even more so, because he has still been tinkering with some of them. I've noticed that, some of the early digital effects, he's still been improving them as time's gone on for different releases. I think there was something on the internet that showed you C-3PO in the desert, and it showed you the different versions that have been broadcast. I seem to remember the movie remaster was the best one, but the colour had changed, and the sky had altered, and bits of the desert had, you could see. I think there were 4 different versions of this one shot. And it just changed. It's just developed. If you saw them together like that, they don't even look like the same shot in some cases. Right. So a lot of people, poo-pooed the idea that Disney would get involved, but Disney, I think, have stayed true to the original vision, but they've got the money and they've got the special effects, which I find quite funny, because at the end of the day, it's Industrial Light and Magic, and it's Lucas, and it's all the things he developed to do Star Wars that have ended up ultimately then going over to Disney. You've ended up with people like Pixar and all of Disney and all that lot, sort of using the very things that Lucas developed for Star Wars. And now they've come full circle and they're using them again for Star Wars. So I think that's a wonderful sort of snake eating its tail kind of situation. So why not remaster them, make them bigger and better and brighter, and which he did do. And yet a lot of people were afraid that was, the criticism he got for changing those original movies. The diehard fans gave him a tremendously hard time, when he sort of remumbled them all. But I think that was the right thing to do.
Yeah, but that's a very different. That's a real life controversy. I mean, I don't think he changed the. I mean, there were changes, but they seemed to be more superficial. I mean, I remember that they inserted those giant muskox and bantas, I think they were called. He inserted a few of those into the background. More sand people riding around, so it didn't look like there was only 4 guys like in Land of the Lost, where there's only 3 sleeve stacks in any shot. Yeah. But But I don't know. I still, I mean, when you say Norse mythology, of course, but Norse mythology and Tolkien, the story is very similar. Now, I know people who swear up and down that Tolkien's Lord of the Rings was, anti-industrial revolution and environmental to an extent, and I'm sure there's truth to that. But why, why does it have to be just that and not a story about good versus evil or God versus the devil or whatever you want it to be? I mean, and you put that in there. I mean, some things can be more than one thing. So the best things are more than one thing, and use analogy and metaphor and simile and parable.
I think one of the driving forces, I think, behind Tolkien was actually war, because he went through periods when this country over here was at war, and he realized that mankind could be incredibly destructive, which, again, going back on theme, you've got the Clone Wars. When you first came on, you said you're quite au fait with the cartoon side of the Star Wars universe, and they really developed the Clone Wars in that. They really went to town on that. But the whole theme of war is something that is true of both the Star Wars universe and Tolkien. Tolkien was very keenly aware of that. So yes, of course, there's going to be an environmental impact. Death Star comes along like that, no planet. That's kind of the warning thing of technology versus nature. The destructive part of that in the Star Wars universe. But the exact same thing was true with Tolkien. He saw destruction. And to some extent, he foresaw the dangers of where technology and development and what have you could take us if it went too far. And I think that dovetails very nicely into what Lucas's vision in the Star Wars universe is, because he has actually pushed that further, because some of the planets have suffered that. So there are bits of planets floating around here, there and everywhere. There's planets that have exploded. There's planets that have gone desolate. There's whole civilizations that have vanished inside the Star Wars universe, in the same way as it was with Tolkien and Lord of the Rings. So again, I think Tolkien influences the Star Wars universe. I seem to remember as well in the 1980s when they sent the exhibition round, I'm pretty sure Lord of the Rings was in there as an influence.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, the what they call them, the Oroquai, the orcs that were goblins that can daywalk, basically. To me, that's essentially the clones, and clones are a way to dehumanize humans, because despite trying a little bit, most of the characters in the Star Wars universe are humans, and they're pretty much they're largely humanoid as well. But the clones were all basically based on Boba Fett or whatever. But to me, this is almost like any Age of Heroes mythology, sort of, whether it's Ragnarok or, the Viking way or the Greek heroes, the Trojan War. We focus on a bunch of characters who were sort of your demigods, and sometimes gods would come into it, especially in Norse. But then you have all of these fungible army members that don't get names, but they need to be there also. In Ragnarok, you have the warriors from Valhalla and whatever the Vanir equivalent was. I forgot the name of Freya's hall. But in Greek, they said they had 100,000 men there, and you knew the 200 heroes or so who were all demigods. But all of the other people weren't as well. Not even all of the kings were demigods. They were just kings who were. But maybe all the kings were demigods at that point. Anyway,
I think that's something Star Wars does well, because it doesn't take the god thing to the extreme. If you understand what I mean.
That's what I'm saying. I think that the clones were sort of your fungible, unnamed militia. Your Jedis and your heroes were sort of your demigods. The Force, I guess, is sort of your general, your Uranus, your Anu, your heavens god that is sort of disinterested, sort of took a step back. Is you can get Sith and Jedi from it, just like
he's going down the biological route, isn't he? I mean, we're talking about clones biology, and that was Tolkien's view of the Uruk-hai, was that they were engineered. Right. So again, like you say, stormtroopers engineered. I always chuckle when I see all the stormtroopers compiling in and they're all different heights, because if they were clones, they'd all be the same height, so that's right through the whole Star Wars universe. They're all different heights.
Well,
but the whole idea
address that later on. They said that not all stormtroopers were clones. They were often, they were volunteers, they were conscripts, but they were like kidnapped children who became stormtroopers.
Yeah, but it just tickled me up when they came out with the idea of them being clones. They were all different heights. I had a real good chuckle on that one.
Yeah, absolutely.
But yeah, the idea of there being a god character, what they're doing is they've changed that in the Star Wars universe. They've got a force of nature. That's what they're sort of mirroring there. In a lot of the ancient legends and the ancient texts, you've got this idea that planet Earth is alive and that it's a living being. I think now we term it Gaia, which is this idea of something bigger than us. And I think with Star Wars, they went down the route of the midichlorians, which was this idea that people can be really strong with the Force. What they're actually saying is the power of nature. The power that's behind everything, behind the planet and the galaxy and the universe, the cosmos. This power is something that's sort of physical and tangible and actually in there. So in a sense, what they've done is they've taken off the top tier. That's gone. So we don't have all these amazing god figures, I don't think, in the same way that they had in the past. There isn't an equivalent to, Ra or Odin or whatever. They don't have all this top tier, they don't have a god with a capital G, but they do have this kind of human spirituality, which I think is why you've seen this, over here they do a census every now and again, and it says, what is your religion? There was one year, I think we had over 10,000 people put Jedi, and the government over here put its foot down and went, no, you can't do that. You can't put Jedi. But by rights, if you get more than 10,000, then it becomes an established religion. So in this country, technically in the UK, we have the religion of Jedi, because there's more than 10,000 followers. But it's the idea of this sort of enormous amount of power that's there in nature. It's latent, it's there inside everything that's alive. And also everything pretty much is alive. So, it's that connectivity. Although I haven't seen any Jedi wandering around my village, levitating stuff or, swinging around a proper lightsaber. Although they have got proper lightsabers now. I did see a thing where there's a chap that's made one, and it'll cut through metal and it'll do all sorts of things, but not necessarily in a safe way. It was a don't try this one at home moment, Well,
what lightsabers are sort of don't try this at home. You need to be trained to use it properly, though. I mean, I understand what you mean. You push a button, it illuminates. You push it down to the button, it depowers. Whereas this other guy's, it's probably maybe more explodey.
It showed him using it as like a torch. He had a huge mains cable going to it, and he could cut through a sheet of metal with it. It was that hot.
But somehow for a lightsaber, they didn't build the perfect lightsaber the first time.
Oh no, obviously not. But this thing he's put something into the electronics that limits the length of the jet that comes from it. So when he pushes the button, it does actually function like a lightsaber. It has got a limit, But the idea of divine swords, while we're on the subject of lightsabers, sticking to the main theme, divine swords are all over legend. They're everywhere. They go all the way back to the Bible. This idea that you can have a divine weapon, a sacred weapon. I believe Lucas actually consciously went out of his way to develop this idea. I seem to remember, just in the back of my mind, I think there was a funny story about the Force and about lightsabers. I seem to remember the origin of both of those being, I think it was his daughter came up with one of them. And somebody in the cast came up with the other. I think there's a definite story there. I mean, folks can go and check into that, but I'm pretty sure the Force and lightsabers, they weren't Lucas's original intention. They weren't the idea at the beginning. It's something that got added in as this huge mixing bowl began to coalesce into the first movie. There's also a fantastic shot somewhere of Sir Alec Guinness, and he's about to do this final battle with, you know, Darth Vader, and you want to see the size of the electric cable coming out of the back of the lightsaber, which they had to get rid of course. You don't see it, but this enormous cable vanishes up his sleeve and disappears into his cloak, comes out the back of him. You know what I mean? Because at 1970s, like you say, people forget just how long ago that movie was. You know, it was a hugely long time back in movie terms, you know.
Sure.
But yeah,
I mean, if you go, it's almost 50 years ago. You go 50 years before that, you're starting to get to the first talking movies, you know, the first more than musical and funny sounds. But yeah, the light sword, the lightsaber, like you're saying, I mean, you know, Excalibur is obvious. The cherubim with the fire sword, Sutter the fire giant with his you know, sword of fire. I mean, yeah, it's you know, definitely out there. You know, lots of.
If you go into legend, I mean, they had things like the sword of Constantine. They had the sword of Arthur, obviously, the sword of Olga the Dane, Olga Dansk. They had all these different sort. The sword of Saint Peter was another one, biblical one. You know, they had all these different swords, and that's where it comes from. You know, I'm yet to see anyone in Star Wars, you know, throw their sword into a lake. I think that would probably cause absolute chaos. Yeah.
Well, they'd have to pick the best lightsaber of them all. I mean, yeah, right.
Of course.
I mean, not all lightsabers are created equal, but you know, none has like this sort of preeminent place. I mean, you have the fun ones. They're sort of like staffs, which you know, you have a lightsaber on each end of the staff, and sometimes you can turn those into two lightsabers. And then, of course, you had General Grievous, who was working with 4 at a time, and then you had other Jedis who, you know, work with a long sword and a short sword. I mean,
well, I know the listeners are not necessarily going to agree with me here, but the moment for me was that moment when Darth Maul has the double-ended saber, and he's just about to, you know, get stuck in, and you see the lightsaber come out, and everyone's like, "Hey, this is going to be a great battle." Then all of a sudden, the second one comes out. That moment in that movie is just genius. And then I still think that sword battle where they're fighting with the doors that shut and open, that is one of the best battles. That where they really get stuck in and Darth Maul gets sliced in half. That battle. The actual sword work in that is second to none. I think it's absolutely superb. Yes, we've had some good ones since then, but you know, I still think in the movies that's phenomenal. But, and I've got to say this, but there are some great amateur battles online. If you go and check on the internet, some of these guys out there who've, you know, got sabers of their own are producing some absolutely incredible, you know, lightsaber battles. I've seen some great ones over the years. I'd imagine Lucas himself probably occasionally goes on there and goes, "Oh, you know, wonder if we can improve what we're doing. You know, have a look what the fans are doing." But some of the fan fights are just phenomenal. So anybody that's listening, you know, I would encourage you to go and have a look at what the fans are doing, because the fans, I think, even managed to top Darth Maul. And you know, there's some of the battles are just phenomenal. I don't think you could manage to top Grievous in terms of numbers, you know, sheer numbers of swords. But I did see, and this is going to amaze you, I actually saw a cosplay costume that actually was General Grievous. It looked like Grievous and it functioned, which I could see, you know, by your face that it's one of those, how the hell do you do that moment? Yeah. But I think there was some guy behind it operating it, but it was just a superb rendition, as it were, of Grievous. And again, what a fabulous character.
There's a lot of work to do with General Grievous. I mean, basically there's almost nothing left of the, you know, the living being. It's almost all, you know, robot, and it's basically a walking praying mantis, sort of, but on steroids. Yeah, definitely. I actually know someone who, you know, that does some of that Star Wars stuff, and yeah, he was in the military, and like his, you know, there's a whole military unit that were fans, and you know, because the military trained, they can use tactics and recreate battles and things that they probably studied at war colleges and things like that, you know, and recreate it and do better than a filmmaker who, you know, probably didn't have the advantage of those things. And in 1975 and 1976, when you're making the movie, I mean, now you've got consultants for everything. There's, ex-military people, you got generals, they're on there. I'm not sure that they were doing it then, and I'm not sure even if they were doing it then, that George Lucas had the budget for that. I mean, some things looking back, you're wondering how it ever got made. Now it's easy to see how things like that got made, and the technology is amazing. But I don't want to stray too much from the original point. So going into mythology, it's funny that Darth basically was a synonym for Lord, but not exactly, because sometimes they were called Lord. So Darth, it's almost like Baal was sort of meant sort of like, was sort of a title, like almost like Sir or Knight or Lord, but Baal has evolved into something evil. So it's like, and Vader is just one of the cognate words, in language drift somewhere along the line for father. So basically his name was Lord Father, but sort of like evil Lord Father. And the thing with the Force that, I was getting to is that in the oldest version, in the oldest definitions of sort of the jinn and the Greek word daemon, which became demon, these now people think of them and they think they're malevolent spirits, and they weren't. They had the choice. They had the choice to do what they want, almost like the angels did, that when some chose to become fallen angels, which they didn't choose to become fallen angels, but they chose a different path, which then turned them into demons after they lost the war. But they had choice. They weren't born necessarily or created necessarily good or evil. They could make a choice, and that was sort of the Force writ large. And the Jedis and the Sith sort of are the same thing, and they seem to be sort of in somewhat equal numbers, until the Great Massacre, when the clones turned on them, or when the clones were to turn on them. I don't know if that comes from mythology anywhere. I don't think so.
Occasionally, things like that make me wonder if Lucas is looking at the world around him and trying to perhaps warn us or predict. There are elements creeping into the new Star Wars universe that are not easily traceable back to ancient stories. And like you say, this idea of people having to make a choice, or forces having to make a choice, that clearly is part of what goes on in mythology. There's no doubt about that at all. As you say, a daemon, or a demon as it was in Greek, was just a force, and the force itself had separate will and separate entity and could make a choice. But if you go back far enough in the Greek, those demons, the daemons, are actually associated with us. We can, as it were, push them one way or another. Well, you're into the realms of the Emperor, clearly. Who chooses, dark or light? Who chooses the Emperor? Who chooses the Force? You're into that. There's been a couple of moments where people have come in front of the Emperor Palpatine, and had to make that decision. Do they go dark side, or do they go for the Force? And I think
he's like the snake offering the apple to Eve.
Absolutely, totally. And the way they developed that character, because obviously he came in, you can see him sort of come from nowhere. And I think everybody kind of knew who was the Emperor and who was the bad guy before they actually did that reveal. I think you sort of had a pretty good idea of who was, pulling the strings, because you're back in the days of Darth Maul again. So, it's all that kind of era. But yes, the idea of having to make a choice. And as I say, I think occasionally Lucas looks forward rather than backwards. And that, that might be a message, if you like, within Star Wars, where actually one of the keys to it all is making the choice. That's the punchline.
Here's the other thing, and maybe I'm stretching a little bit, but going biblical, which, if you go biblical, I don't want to bore everyone with all my analogy, but if you go biblical enough and go into comparative mythology, you can probably find a cognate anywhere. But like Darth Vader, or really more to the point, Anakin Skywalker, was sort of both Cain and Abel. And the interesting thing about the Star Wars universe, and I think some of the movies that came after the original three really tried to go away from it on purpose. which I think was sort of losing the plot a little bit. But hopefully people will see where I'm going. And a fairly well-known writer who was involved in Hollywood, but also in other kinds of literature, wrote something called The Case for the Empire. And basically what he said is that the Jedis were an elitist religious cult who were withholding their power from most other people. The galaxy was in chaos. It was run by, warlords, gang lords, business interests. The technology was dilapidating, even though it appeared modernistic. It also appeared rusty and breaking down, and people on planets were basically living like they were in deserts and on the outposts, and their societies were barely cohesive, whereas in the Empire they were trying to bring cleanliness and order, and you could see the Empire, everyone's in clean clothes and clean uniforms, everything's tidy, orderly. The planets, where the Empire was headquartered, big cities, big technology, clean, no crime, all of this. And it's almost sort of like saying, the Empire got a bad rap, so they made them worse, but they all, by stealing. It wasn't all clones; it was stealing children. But also they made planets like, Alderaan and the undersea world where Jar Jar Binks lived, and some of these other free planets to look just as beautiful and pristine as the Empire planets, to sort of take away that people going, yeah, maybe the Empire was pretty bad, but this universe sucked. And
absolutely,
and maybe I'd rather. I mean, you're in the UK, so I don't know what things are like really over there. But New York City, is where I'm from originally. I'm from New York originally, not from the city, but my father worked in the city, etc. And believe it or not, Rudy Giuliani was sort of the hero of New York City when he was the mayor. He now looking back, people hate a lot of things he did, stop and frisk. There were, certainly racial inequities that came to do with it. But the city was safer. The city was cleaner. The city, resuscitated. Bloomberg was sort of like a kinder, gentler version of Giuliani and the success cake. But there continued. But there was sort of, erosion at the edges. And he still kept with the stop and frisk, which was basically, I forget what they called it, no broken windows, or there was no such thing as minor crime, which of course continued the racial, inequities and injustice. And, it's always the balance between civil rights and order, chaos and order, freedom and control or safety. And
well, I was going to say we live on a tiny island over here. I mean, we're smaller by far than any of the states in America, but in terms of what you've just described, we have at least 3 Star Wars planets here, because the equivalent to your New York obviously is our London. I mean, right. London is very, very like that. That's kind of, that's what it's like, which, sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. Well, clearly that's the Empire. The whole idea of having somewhere that's absolutely gorgeous, and it's a wonderful place, and it's based on nature. We've got pockets of that over here as well. We've got, things like Wales and Scotland and parts of Southern Ireland, and there's loads of bits of the UK that kind of would fit that bill. But then we've also got Mos Eisley Spaceport in the form of Edinburgh and Glasgow and inner city Birmingham and parts of Liverpool and Manchester are technology that has not survived the test of time particularly well.
Your mining areas are a lot like, in Solo, that planet.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, we've got that here as well. Yeah. But I think going back to what you were saying about, Empire versus, the Jedi, I think really maybe what Lucas was getting at with all of that was if the good guys don't step up, then quite clearly the clever guys, the technological guys, are going to zoom into that vacuum. And that is quite clever, because it's not an automatic equation. You wouldn't automatically think that was going to happen. And yet in the 21st century, right here, right now, that is exactly what we're seeing happening. Through all of what we've suffered over the last few years, most of the people who, as it were, you would have thought of as Jedi, which is your major religions, people in religious power, etc., they've all sort of disappeared. They've all vanished. Where have they gone? They've all sort of, gone, and then you've ended up with the people who are, with the technology and the civilization and the mechanisms to do it. They've kind of flooded into that vacuum, and we've almost become the empire. We've almost ended up in a situation where we have that sort of measure of technology and control creeping in, basically because the Jedi have not stepped up. So, and I think Lucas was onto that. I think he was onto that a long time ago. There's a huge debate about, how much Hollywood and movie making affects what goes on in the world at large, and how much it reflects and predicts what goes on in the world at large. Lucas and Spielberg, I think, they're absolute dab hands at, looking at the big picture and then bringing it all in. What you said earlier on, by the way, about, not necessarily having experts and what have you available. I think the budget alone means that they could probably get hold of pretty much anything if they wanted to. I think what happens on screen, though, really comes down to the script writers, and executive decisions. If they've not majored on a huge lightsaber battles and all the rest of it, the reason is probably because that's just not the road that they want to go down. It's more or less that. We've almost come full circle. You're almost back to where I was in 1976. Making this little amateur movie with characters dressed in the appropriate colours. And that was based on legend. You're almost back to the same position again, where it is down to the director. It's down to the script writer. It's still movie making. It's still the art of producing films. And those films say something. They've got to reflect something, and I think that's what we're seeing with Star Wars. Some of the new ones, I mean, moving on to the new material, things like Solo and Rogue One and Ahsoka, which is the one that's just coming on now, the one with what's her name? It's
Dawson.
That's it. Yeah, that's it. That's the one.
Sorry, not Dawson.
That's it. Yeah. So that one's going. All of those are going down the sort of new route, and they're dealing with new issues. So I'm going to watch them very keenly to see what the message behind them is. I think folks in general should do that. The whole Star Wars community should be looking at these things and seeing, picking out the message behind them, because they're great special effects, fantastic entertainment. I mean, over here we had a guy called Jerry Anderson. He did Thunderbirds and a lot of other fairly well-known things, UFO and one or two, Space 1999. The thing with Jerry Anderson was he always blew something up, and you've got this same spectacle with Star Wars. They're always blowing things up, and
sure.
It's all big, and it's industrial light and magic. It's exactly what it is, but there's a message. I think people tend to lose their ability to see beyond the flashing lights, and the spectacle of it all. There is a message in there. Every time Lucas has spoken, in interviews about the Star Wars universe, he does tend to drop breadcrumbs about the message behind things. He's extremely good at doing that. Yeah.
Well, I mean, Alderaan, we see it in the earlier movies and in the series that take place, more towards the prequel time before, A New Hope and Return of the Jedi, when, Alderaan gets blown up in A New Episode 4. And then we later on see Alderaan. I mean, it is sort of almost like Eden-esque. And, and of course the Empire blows it up, and it's almost like the Empire saying, I'm God. The bad force is God. You can't get too close to me. I'm the only one who can bring order to your world and your universe, and anyone else who dares try, I'm going to destroy your Tower of Babel. Now, that is really twisting and stretching what the metaphor of the Tower of Babel is. But
and the Death Star. Ultimately, the Death Star was blown up as well. So
right, twice. Two different versions. The Death Star got blown up. So haha. And I think that I think that Lucas maybe consciously or unconsciously was going. There's always this tug of war for balance, but despite what popular thought might be these days, it seems like the only way to get that balance is that you have to have, like you said, you have to have the Jedi step up. You have to have, like Lisa Simpson said, in order to avoid war, you must or in order to have peace, you must prepare for war. I'm sure she was probably quoting Sun Tzu, but but there's definitely a lot of mythology in there. And I guess my question to you is, because I saw the interviews too, but I saw them when I was young, and I haven't revisited them. Sounds like you sort of revisited them. I am wondering if these tropes, these storytelling devices, these Joseph Campbell's Heroes of a Thousand Faces journey, Iliad kind of things, were just imprinted on Lucas like they are on all of us, or are sort of built into our DNA, or did he go digging? Did he really do a lot of research and actually go deep into these things, or did he just go surface level, but the rest is sort of embedded in everything that all of us know and grow up on, and all the stories and books and tales that we hear and heard? So was it that the tropes and the archetypes were already part of him, or did he research the archetypes and put them on the screen?
Okay, I think there's two answers to that. One's a simple one, and one's probably not so simple. The simple answer is yes. Basically, we all have the same basic subconscious mental structure that's in us. It's almost like inherited through our DNA that things are a certain way. That's our concept of good and evil, of reality. This is how it is, and whether it's conditioning or whether it's something that is born into us, that's a whole other debate. That's an entire subject of its own. So needless to say, the answer is yes. Of course, Lucas has got the same biological, mental, physiological makeup that we've got. So he's got all of those archetypes in him. They're already there. But, and this is the second answer, you can kind of see Spielberg and Lucas and a few of the other production guys sat there at the bar, and knocking back the shots one night with a pen and paper. I think that's closer to what we actually see happening. I don't think it's down to just Lucas or Lucas and Spielberg, or Spielberg and Lucas, because they work together on Spielberg's movies as well. I don't think they are just the controlling influence. I think a lot of it is produced by committee. I think ultimately, and this was the thing about the Disney thing as well, ultimately I think Lucas has been very clever and he's maintained control, because I don't think you could hold together something like the Star Wars universe without having a central living, directing, writing, human being with a vision. I think that's probably the moral of that tale, is that, if somebody has a vision, a determined vision, and they know where they're going with it, then it's better to do that and then have lots of other people bolt their ideas on. But I don't think Lucas kind of sat there, on Wikipedia going through every single legend he could get his hands on. But at the same time, I think he has studied a lot. But he's also, and this perhaps is the moral of this one, is that he's surrounded himself with people who've done exactly the same thing. So, if he wants to create a planet that seems to have a slightly oriental feel, then he'll go and find experts in that field. I did hear that he wanted to change styles for lightsaber fighting for certain characters in certain ways. And he has gone off to other, you mentioned Sansui, and, there are other people who are, experts in the art of war, and they know swordsmithing, they know swordsmanship. And he's gone off and consulted them. There's no doubt about it. Really, that's the job of a producer. I produce documentaries and stuff like that. So I know that if I need something and I haven't got it, I'll go and find it. That's the bottom line. So the first answer is yes, but the second answer is no, it's committee. There's more to it than that. But it's quite clever, because really what we're doing is, if those little elements of what would you call it? Not fantasy, but if those creative elements exist in everybody, then what an absolutely genius idea to get everybody involved, because you're sucking all of that information in and then putting it back out again. So everyone's going to find something. because
so it's a little
everyone's
chicken and a little egg.
Everyone's put because everybody's put different things in. Then the people who are watching it are going to get different things back out. Yeah,
I think a different debate for another day is whether or not Lucas has actually held it together, and whether it's still at his vision and still. Because I'm not exactly sure about that, but I don't. Yeah. That doesn't need to be the topic of this show, because the mythology is the mythology. Though, as stories change and shift, their influences, including mythologies, might as well. But I wanted to take some time because this show we're recording this in mid-October, but October for Garden of Doom is dedicated to Halloween and sort of terror and horror and things that go bump in the night shows. So this show will most likely drop in November. And on November 1st, you have a book that's going to be available for sale on UFOs. And I don't think Star Wars mythology or otherwise, mythology and UFOs to me go hand in hand anyway. Yeah. But so tell us about this book, which by the time this drops, will have just basically been brand spanking new, available for sale.
Yeah, I think we're still on topic. Absolutely, still think we're on topic. I mean, you're talking super technology. You're talking about, space, travel, time, aliens. You name it. Absolutely, bang on. There was a crash in a Welsh village called Clonilla back in 1983. And something hit trees and bounced across 4 fields, leaving debris, but managed to fly off despite losing all this debris. A crash recovery team from a local UFO group got there and recovered all these pieces of debris. So they ended up with about half a dozen of these bits after the cleanup operation had apparently already taken place. So I'm paraphrasing this. Anyway, fast forward to 2008, the guys who's kept these pieces got in contact with me, said, can we do a documentary? So we did a documentary, and this thing called Europe's Roswell came out, which I know is available online. You can find it; it's out there. And then I end up getting this publishing deal with Philip Mantle. Now, as you mentioned earlier on, we've done Crystal Skulls and Human Heads, which was the first book I did for Philip, which is kind of archaeoscience, and then along comes the King Arthur book, which took me 45 years to write. And I thought, Philip, bless him, took that one on. That was a challenge. And then, he publishes that, and I'm like, okay, we're up to the 3rd book now. And he's like, don't you think it's time you did one on UFOs, so that's what I'm supposed to be publishing? So I said, yeah, okay. He said, well, it's 40 years. It's 40 years since the crash in 1983. So what we did was we got all the information we could, and then all the updates and all the interviews that have been done with the chap who found the debris. And basically we've got the story thus far of how it brings us up to date. But best of all, Philip said, okay, we're going to get a couple of labs and test this stuff. We'll get a couple of samples, send them off and see what happens, which we did. But very last minute, I mean, we were going to try and get the book out in January because that's when the crash took place. Anyway, it's took from then till now, as you say, 1st of November, to get this book out, Europe's Roswell, 40 Years Since Impact. That's what it's called. It's on Flying Disc Press, published by Philip Mantle. And we got some really entertaining results back. We did a test in Australia. We did a test in the United States. That's on the back of a test that had already been done here in the UK. And believe me, some of the material is, shall we say, exotic. And it's definitely in the Star Wars category because it should not have existed in 1983. It doesn't give you the answers, but it certainly raises all the questions. And I think it's the only book that anyone's actually done where you get to the end of the book and you actually get to see the physical evidence. It's not like blinking lights or clouds of gas or, I met this green guy on a road, and there's no, this is proof. This is hard show and tell.
So are we talking about like elements like metals and heavy metals and rare earth materials or rare materials that were not yet on our periodic table or maybe still aren't?
Well, okay, I suppose I could drop the bomb because if this is going out after the book's published, people can go and check it out. I'll give you the basic results. The initial result was they sent some material off to British Aerospace in this country, in the UK, but they did it off the record. It was an off-books test. And British Aerospace basically came up with the fact that this was aluminium, some kind of aluminium, but they couldn't say any more than that. They couldn't identify the resin that was on it, the paint that was on it. There's a rubberized substance on it. They couldn't identify any of those things. They'd never seen anything like it. There was no names or labels or formula for any of this. But they realized that the silver metal, the principal contents of that was aluminium. So they sent this report back and said, oh, it's duralumin. Well, duralumin is a trade name. It's like Coca-Cola. You know, it's not an actual substance. It's a substance based on aluminium. But they said it's an incredibly pure alloy of aluminium. We've never seen anything quite like this. It's just incredible. And that was somewhere in the, I assume, 1980s or 1990s. That's when that test was done. Anyway, we sent one off to Australia. Australia comes back and goes, it's not duralumin. So we're like, oh, what do you mean it's not duralumin? They went, it's aluminium, but it's aluminium foam. Now, at this point, we're like, foam? Metal foam? How do you get foam? Anyway, they've come up with this special, I can't give you all the chemical formula for it, but it's a special type of aluminium. And what they do is they can form it as a foam, and it sets at room temperature, and it becomes hard, and it becomes this aluminium, which is fairly exciting stuff. You know, now they were struggling as well with the rubberized substance, the paint and the resin. They were struggling with that, but they said, when did you say this thing crashed? And I'm like, 1983. Oh, no, they didn't have anything like this back then. So, okay, that's caused a problem. But we know that that's where this stuff's come from. And that's pretty much where that ended. Now then, USA, this is where it gets interesting. The Australians said, well, the glue that's used in this, the bonding resin, is an American type of glue. And they actually quoted what the glue was. And the American laboratory comes back and says, no, we haven't got a clue what any of these things are. Not the foggiest idea. They said, but your principal metal is lanthanum. Okay. Now, it's 90-something% lanthanum or lanthanum. Now, you're into exotic metals, you're into stuff that costs millions of pounds to mine. It's everywhere. It's all over the place. You know, it does occur out in the cosmos. You do find it in galaxies and planets and stars, meteorites, comets. But that's not the sort of thing you would just sort of go out and just dig up. You know, it's not like, you know, quartz. It's not on that level. But there's a lot of it around. It's just hard to get hold of. Now then, this gets ultra interesting now. Some of the debris on these fields were sheets in excess of 6 foot, which is like 2 meters. So you got 4 fields covered in sheets of aluminium foam and lanthanum. Now, at this point, you're thinking, where the hell's all that lanthanum come from? That's an enormous amount, vast amount. I've reached a conclusion of my own that I think one of the parts of the shell is made from lanthanum. So you've got a sheet of this stuff, lanthanum, and then another part of the same shell is made from this aluminium foam. So it's 2 different substances stuck together. And I think that the 2 labs got 2 different pieces of metal. I don't think they got the same piece of metal. But in answer to your original observation, all of what we're looking at is bonkers. It's all exotic. It's very strange. Excuse me. We've actually put the breakdown, the chemical breakdown, in the book. Now, in the book, I don't reach any conclusions. I just make a couple of observations and I leave it at that, because I know what's going to happen. It's going to open the floodgates. We're going to get all sorts of stuff coming back. And, you know, maybe we've nailed it. Maybe we know what it is. Just at the end, just as a kicker, as we'd already sent the book off, so we couldn't put this really in. I could only put mention of it. There was a photograph that came up on the internet of some crushed aluminium foil that a metal detectorist had got off Roswell, New Mexico. It's identical to the foil that we got with the crash debris from Clonillar. So now you've got this massive question. Are these things coming down? Are they crashing? And are we back engineering their technology? You know, maybe what we were seeing that was, spread across that field in 1983 was actually some consequence of what occurred at Roswell. But that's it. That's the exclusive story.
All right. Well, we got an exclusive. Well, I have two questions. Well, one question and one which is speculation, but ends with an invitation for you to counter speculate, which I guess is sort of a question. So the one question, and this is something I know nothing about. I know a little bit about carbon dating. I know that geologists and other scientists can date things, but is it possible to date these metals? I know that we have dated things that have landed on Earth, meteorites, asteroid bits, or whatever, cometary particles that are older than Earth itself. Are we able? Is there any way to date these materials?
It's an interesting question, and the observation that I can throw back is, as far as we can tell, there is no carbon. So we're a bit stuck on that one. I mean, it's hard enough to date metal anyway, but there are occasions when things are attached to the metal that are dateable. I don't think this is one of those occasions because we don't have carbon in the analysis.
And it's so fabricated that manufactured that there wouldn't be any geological way to find age in it.
No. And the American laboratory in particular came back and just said, we don't know what this is.
Well, we're a little lazy over here,
No, they just couldn't tell us what it was. Well, they could tell us what it was made of, but they'd never seen anything like it. So,
all right, here's my rank speculation, which is to invite counter speculation. When I think of aluminum, I don't think of, and I love how the British people say aluminium. It makes it sound so special. But when I think of aluminum, I don't think of foam. I think of the stuff that you wrap your leftovers in, if you're not too lazy to just throw them in the fridge in the cardboard box and say, the microwave will soften it up. But not that I've ever done that, of course. But when you say foam, it makes, and you said it gets hardened when it comes into, I guess, an atmosphere, a certain temperature condition, or maybe when it hits the atmosphere and it needs to harden up to protect against reentry. None of that stuff is the speculation. The speculation is that when I think foam, I think something that, it might be semi-permeable, which means that maybe whatever life form was in there is, more like jellyfish-like, more permeable than, say, a solid, hard carbon-based human, hippopotamus, monkey, whatever. It might be something more like that can get through, can sort of liquefy itself, or maybe it is liquid. I don't know if I'm making any sense, but or maybe it's like a portal. It can harden when it needs to, but it can soften when it doesn't, and you can sort of go through. It's like like an airlock, like a space lock. Is there? A, am I making sense? And B, if so, can you rescue me?
Yeah, it's an interesting speculation because the hexagonal sort of rubbery surface that we've got attached to this metal, we ourselves have speculated that maybe that functioned like a giant circuit. So in a sense, that particular surface would be alive because you could send signals. If you could control them, if it's conductive, you could send signals across this hexagonal surface. You could actually have like a giant circuit, that would send electrical energy anywhere. Well, the kicker is that's the stuff that's attached to the aluminium foam. So the two bits that you might speculate could potentially be organic, they are both joined together face to face in the same surface. It's not the lanthanum, it's the aluminium that's got this rubberized stuff attached to it. So there is room there definitely for speculation, to the point where what was observed by the Australian lab is the metal that has been aluminium foam has actually deteriorated. So there's an element of when you bring this metal into the Earth's atmosphere, when it's here and it's not doing whatever job it was designed to do, it deteriorates at quite a fast rate, which to me is more organic. It's not like a sheet of solid metal. because it's been made of this foam and it's incredibly lightweight, sooner or later it's going to deteriorate and just go back to being powder again, over a long period of time. So it's not as substantial or as solid. And that's always been a problem with all of the debris. None of the debris seems to be substantial or solid enough in itself to form a vehicle, some kind of flying craft as we would understand it. Sure. So there's plenty of room for speculation. That's a pretty good question, actually.
Well, more rank speculation before I go back to some of the more obvious things on Star Wars and theosophy, theology, mythology that we haven't gotten into for whatever reason or reasons. But it seems like, and these are not mutually exclusive things with the foam nature of the aluminum, but space is empty, but there's lots of stuff in it. There's radiation, there's dark matter, which has energy we don't really fully understand. You can hit other things, but if it's if it's a vessel that's supposed to go from point to point, planet to planet, planets to planet, there's atmospheres, there's landings. I'm almost thinking like how submarines they're double hull, but inside there's like lattice work, like a woodpecker's skull, that helps it absorb it, so you don't break your brain, you don't break the interior. That maybe this foam is sort of, because it is a little bit more fungible, can absorb it. It's like insulation in the middle of two different firmament materials, harder materials, but it helps with the absorption of maybe both impact, but also radiation or energy, and maybe somehow is a source where they can recycle, use the energy, almost like put your cable into it and you plug it in, like you're recharging your batteries with the solar and other radiation, background radiation in the universe.
Well, a very, very similar observation was made by the crash recovery crew, because this thing was about 25 foot wide, and when it came down, it hit trees, and it was the trees that smashed all the debris off it before it flew off. Now, if this thing's doing 200 million miles an hour and it's flying through time and space and all the rest of it, clearly the structure functions extremely well, because it would almost, in a sense, harden up in the act of doing that. But if it's going slow enough to be pounded by trees, the trees smashed it like an eggshell. They actually pummeled the way through whatever was on the bottom of this thing, shattered it, and caused it to break up. So what you're saying is absolutely. We don't know where these pieces have come from and what form and what function they would originally have had. But clearly this thing was doing something it was not designed to do. So it was not designed to be impacted by anything at slow speed, like branches and hitting the tops of trees. That was sufficient to do quite a lot of damage. So if you really take that sort of thought process to its limit, maybe this thing was never intended to be flying around like an aeroplane at all, or flying in space at all. Maybe the guys who are thinking in terms of interdimensional travel, travel in time and space, that we're unaware of, where it's dealing with different conditions and different, rules, regulations, laws of physics, etc., to what we'd be used to. Maybe that's the realm that we're actually floating into with this.
So they teleported, and their calculations were, if they were like Nightcrawler from the X-Men, but they teleported into the wrong, in between a wall and ripped out his own intestines.
Yeah, they appeared all right in the sky, and then they kind of, oh, hang on a minute, what's going on?
We're 10,000 feet too low, or whatever.
Yeah. Something clearly went wrong. It was definitely in a place it shouldn't have been. There's no doubt about that.
All right. Well, some other things about Star Wars that we clearly skipped over. Don't know why, but we had a long and lengthy conversation. But so Ben Kenobi, not the father of Luke, but sacrifices himself. So you've got the sacrifice, but you turn into the Jedis. And it seems like the Jedis can do this, but the Sith, I'm not exactly clear that they can do this. But they sort of return in a ghostly, semi-corporeal, interactive form. Sort of Holy Ghostish, or just plain old ghostish. But you have the sacrifice, and then of course Luke does his he's exiled himself to Dagobah to learn the ways. That's sort of Dagobah was a bleak, dreary swamp planet where nothing was supposed to be, or no intelligent life was supposed to be alive. That's sort of like a trip into the underworld. Ben Kenobi put himself into the wilderness, into exile. The hermit, the wizard hermit, certainly, is a trope. I mean, the thing about Star Wars is that as it kept continued, it would sort of kill the tropes. But Ben Kenobi was, put himself as a hermit because he was one of the last of his kind. Well, it turns out he's, nowhere, not exactly near the last of his kind. There's this whole host of evil of his kind. But that's where I think Star Wars sort of lost its thread, and we all know why. It's to continue the franchise and to make more toys and action figures and stuff like that. But I mean, the sacrifice and going into the wilderness and going into the underworld. I think if you look for it, though, and Holy Ghost or Ghost period, that sort of oracle, telling the future. All of that is sort of embedded in Star Wars as well. And I would actually invite our listeners to maybe, contact me. You can do it at Icarus Fell MD on Twitter. Garden of Doom has a Facebook page. Most of you know my name, and you can email me. It's not that hard to do, or send me a message on Messenger and see if you see any parallels between anything in any mythology, theology. If you see relationships to the Indian gods of Vedic India, if you see relations to to Japanese mythology or Babylonian, or you see the Archangel Michael here, or Beelzebub there, or whatever it is, which characters do you see represented in whether it's Odin or Hercules or Osiris. I'd be interested to know what some of the parallels were. I mean, obviously the Gandalf, Merlin, Odin as Wandering Stranger, Kenobi ones are pretty obvious. Luke is sort of Jesus, but not exactly. He also banishes himself and goes out where he wants to be left alone, becomes cranky. But these are all tropes in mythology as well.
It's like send us your archetypes.
Yeah.
If you can spot an archetype out there, let us know, because there's every possibility, that Lucas might have really, plowed the furrow with that one. It'd be nice to see what folks come up with, how people view it. Clearly, it is a tale of biblical proportions. No doubt about that. There are, descents into hell. There are, resurrection after death. It's all this idea. But again, I think the ghosty thing, I mean, that was a nice twist, because it's going back to the idea that, life doesn't end at the end of life, but that life is everywhere. Life is everything, and it's everywhere. And, the idea that it just suddenly comes to an end is except, like you say, for the bad guys, none of the bad guys tend to come back. So it's an act of omission that almost, suggests judgment of some kind, but, maybe at some point in the future they'll answer that one, so if George Lucas, if you're listening, tell us.
That's right. It seems to be the only Jedi thing. And I'm not an expert on Star Wars canon, but I don't remember seeing, aside from Yoda, any non-human Jedis that, sort of appear later as a ghost. So
certainly the possibility's there, like you say, because Yoda came back. So, the possibility exists.
Yeah, very old, very long lives. Also, very, very biblical in Yoda's lifespan.
Well, that's not just biblical, because the Babylonians and the Mesopotamians, certainly their early king lists, some of their kings I think they only had 10 kings that covered something like 24,500 years. Yeah. So long life, is, again, it's Lucas and his mythology, isn't it? It's doing your research and putting the time in and finding out what's out there,
No, that's absolutely true. That's for sure. And it's implied in the Bible that was the norm, and God chose to change that and limit people's lives to 120 years, because I guess once they go past 120, that's when they're tempted to think they're gods themselves. I mean, I imagine that's the logic in that. Anyway, so we could probably go on and on, but tell people where they can find you. Tell them about the title of the new book, and of course the old books, and where everything can be found, where everything Mark Olly can be found. Because I see that you're on conferences and you're speaking on this and this, and obviously we're friends on Facebook, so I see everything. But I don't know what you want to focus on now, presently.
Well.
Yes.
Usually, I usually only give out 2, but I'm going to give out 3 because, as you rightly say, probably if you want to go and find out what I'm all about, there is tons of material now on YouTube. Because what I've done through a company called Drake, Michigan, I've gone back and 20 years worth of back catalogue. So pretty much everything I've produced or everything I've been featured in and all the extras, it's out there now. It's all on YouTube. So people who are fans of the TV series I did, Lost Treasures, which was 18 years ago, it's all out there on YouTube. So, spend a happy hour or whatever going out there, finding out what's out there, tag it all. There's loads of it. Lost Treasures in particular is a joy. It's an absolute joy. But we've also put out a new documentary. It only came out last month that nobody's ever seen before, The Disappearing Ninth Legion. It's based on a book I did about 6 books back, and it's a cracking documentary. I think it's the best thing we've ever done, and that's literally only come out on YouTube. You can't get that anywhere else. So there's my plug number 1. Go there. If you're sufficiently happy to want to actually own something that I've done, pretty much everything you'll find on Amazon. Okay, so go on to Amazon. All the books are on there. There's 3 regional history ones, Celtic Warrington, Another Mystery, which I did with Churnup Valley Books. There's the 3 that I did for John Hunt Publishing, which is Disappearing Ninth Legion, Robin Hood, ROBYNHOODE, if you want to find that. You'll have to put the right spelling in. And then Revealing the Green Man. So they're out there. And then good old Philip, his 3 are going to be out there by the time this is broadcast. You'll have Crystal Skulls and Human Heads, the Polychronicon of Merlin, Joseph and Arthur, and then you'll have Europe's Roswell, 40 years since impact. So I've been a little bit busy this year. I've been, banging out the product. I guess it's what happens when you reach that magic number, 60, and you think, hang on a minute, I haven't got as long as I've already had. So let's get this stuff out there.
Years left. That's all. You get to 120.
Yeah, I could do, but that's what everyone's going to have to do. They're going to have to imagine I'm a Jedi, back on subject. They're going to all join hands and keep me alive as long as you guys can, feel the force and send me the force. I need plenty of force.
You can either give him your good spirits or you can buy his stuff. Either way, you're going to give him force. So, but check out the YouTube video. That sounds interesting. The missing Ninth Legion. I assume we're talking about Legion. So that's really cool.
Well, the third thing, which I forgot to mention, is Facebook. Come and find me on Facebook. Type my name into Facebook because the link's there for the Ninth Legion. You just reminded me. So basically, you've got YouTube, you've got Amazon, and you've got Facebook.
Absolutely. All right. Well, Mark, I can't thank you enough. This is at least your 4th visit into the Garden of the Doom. I'll try to figure out what we could do next. Maybe it will be the Ninth Legion after enough people have seen it and you want to get your second seating, so to speak, or maybe I'll hit you up for the Celtic mythology, which is a big hole in my game, but seems to be pretty strong in yours. But anyway, we'll chat about that offline, and I'm certainly going to give you a break from me. Anyway, folks, thanks so much for listening. Check out Mark's stuff. By the way, it's MarKolly. So now you know how to spell it. Easy enough to find on Amazon, Facebook, and wherever else you're going to look. Please check out his stuff. Give it a like. Give him a subscribe. Share it. And, of course, part with some of your money makes great Christmas gifts. Listen, if somebody isn't interested in UFOs, they might be interested in King Arthur. If they're not interested in King Arthur, they're probably interested in Robin Hood. This is all great stuff. So, and also, I'd ask you to do the same for us. Share the show, give us a like, give us a review. Those written reviews really go probably further than anything else. But like, subscribe, share, and nothing makes me happier than hearing that somebody referred something to a friend, and that friend says, "Hey, I got referred to your show by so and so, and I'm really glad I checked it out." So, and I do get those, but not enough. So, thank you all for listening, and you will hear us again next week in the Garden of Doom.